Captain Daniel Harris stood on the bridge of the ESS Valiant and watched the stars blur back into focus as the ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The viewport showed a green and blue planet below, beautiful and peaceful looking, but Daniel knew better. This was the Crethon homeworld, and somewhere down there sat the leaders who had decided that Earth should bow to their empire or be destroyed. Daniel had spent 3 months traveling here, 3 months thinking about what would happen when he arrived, and now the moment had come. He turned to look at his crew, men and women who had volunteered for this mission knowing they might not return home. Commander Lisa Bennett sat at her station, her fingers moving across the controls as she brought up tactical information. She had been with Daniel for 5 years now, through peaceful missions and dangerous ones, and he trusted her completely. Lieutenant Jake Morrison manned the weapons station, his young face serious as he watched the Crethon ships beginning to move into position around them. The kid was barely 25, but he had steady hands and a calm mind. Exactly what Daniel needed right now. The communications officer, a woman named Susan Cole, turned in her chair and said that the Crethon Defense Fleet was hailing them. Daniel nodded and told her to wait a moment. He looked out at the thousands of alien ships surrounding his single vessel and felt no fear, only a cold certainty about what he was about to do. The Crethon Empire had been pushing humanity around for years now, taking their colonies, destroying their trade ships, treating Earth like a primitive backwater that existed only to serve the older races. The Galactic Assembly, that grand council of alien species, had done nothing to stop it. They had rules and laws that sounded fair, but those rules only seemed to apply when a weak species complained about a strong one. When the strong took what they wanted, the Assembly looked the other way. 2 months ago, the Crethon had sent their final message to Earth. Surrender all your colonies, accept annexation into our empire, submit to our rule, or we will come and take everything by force. The politicians on Earth had argued for weeks about what to do. Some wanted to negotiate, to find some compromise that would save lives. Others wanted to fight, to show the galaxy that humanity would not go quietly into subjugation. In the end, the decision had been made at the highest levels, and Daniel had been given command of the Valiant with orders that were simple and clear. Go to their homeworld, show them who we are, and make them understand that enslaving humanity would cost more than they were willing to pay. Daniel told Susan to open a channel, but not just to the defense fleet. He wanted every ship, every station, every listening device in this entire star system to hear what he was about to broadcast. Susan worked her controls and gave him a nod. The channel was open and waiting. Daniel could have made a speech, could have threatened them with destruction or promised them war. But he knew that words would mean nothing to beings who had spent thousands of years conquering weaker species. Instead, he transmitted a data package that his ship had carried all the way from Earth. The package spread through the Crethon networks like water flowing downhill, reaching every computer, every screen, every communication device in range. It was a recording, a history lesson that humanity had prepared specifically for this moment. The recording showed war, not the glorious kind with heroes and victories, but the real kind that ground civilizations into dust. It showed the trenches of the First World War, where men had lived in mud and died by the millions for a few yards of ground. It showed the atomic bombs falling on cities, turning hundreds of thousands of people into shadows and ash in an instant. It showed soldiers fighting in jungles and deserts, in frozen mountains and burning cities, humans killing other humans with every weapon their species had ever invented. The recording showed conflicts that had lasted for years, for decades, wars where neither side would surrender no matter how much blood was spilled. It showed a species that had nearly destroyed itself multiple times but had always survived, always rebuilt, always come back stronger and more determined. The final part of the recording was simple. A message in clear language that every species could understand. This is what we do to each other. Imagine what we will do to you. Daniel watched his tactical display as the message spread through the Crethon fleet. He saw ships that had been moving into attack formations suddenly stop. He saw weapons that had been charging suddenly power down. He saw a fleet of thousands hesitate, and in that hesitation he saw fear. Lisa called out readings from her station, noting that the Crethon were not targeting them anymore, that their aggressive posture had changed to something defensive. Jake reported that no weapons were locked onto the Valiant, that the enemy fleet seemed to be waiting for orders that were not coming. Susan said that multiple transmissions were flying back and forth between the Crethon ships and their homeworld. and the tone suggested confusion and argument. Daniel sat down in his command chair and waited. He had shown them the truth about humanity, and now they had to decide what to do with that information. The crew of the Valiant numbered 3,000 souls, men and women who had families and dreams and lives waiting for them back on Earth. Daniel had brought them into the heart of enemy territory, had put them at risk, had gambled everything on the belief that the Crethon would blink first. Minutes passed in silence, and then something remarkable happened. One by one, the Crethon ships began to withdraw, not fleeing, not running away in panic, but pulling back to a safe distance as if they suddenly did not want to be the ones who started a fight. Daniel felt tension drain from his shoulders as he realized his gamble had worked. The Crethon had built their empire on fear and superior technology. They had conquered dozens of species by showing up with overwhelming force and demanding surrender. They had never met a species that scared them back. Now they had seen what humanity was capable of doing to itself, and their imaginations were filling in the blanks about what humanity might do to an actual enemy. Daniel knew this was just the beginning, that the real negotiations would take time, but he had accomplished his primary mission. He had made them afraid, and fear was a language that every species understood. He ordered Lisa to maintain position in orbit, to keep all sensors active, to watch for any sign of treachery. He told Jake to keep weapons ready but not targeted, to show strength without provocation. He told Susan to monitor all communications and report anything unusual. The bridge crew moved efficiently, their training taking over now that the immediate crisis had passed. Daniel looked out at the alien world below and wondered what the Crethon leaders were thinking right now. Were they angry? Frightened? Impressed? It did not really matter. What mattered was that they now understood humanity was not going to be another easy conquest, another weak species to be absorbed and controlled. The Valiant hung in orbit like a sword hanging over the Crethon homeworld, and all across the star system, silence had followed its arrival. Admiral Helen Price sat in the war room aboard the orbital defense platform high above Earth and watched the live feed from the Valiant with emotions she rarely allowed herself to feel. Pride, certainly, because Daniel Harris had done exactly what she had hoped he would do. Concern because the situation was far from over and could still spiral into actual warfare. She had been a military officer for 30 years and had learned that the most dangerous moments often came right after an apparent victory, when one side felt humiliated and might lash out to save face. Lieutenant Commander Greg Palmer stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the data streams coming from across Crethon space. Greg was her intelligence chief, a quiet man who understood alien psychology better than most, and right now his face showed cautious optimism. He pointed to the displays and said that the Crethon military command structure appeared to be falling apart. Several fleet admirals had already ordered their forces to stand down without waiting for Central Command approval. Others were requesting clarification, asking for new orders, essentially paralyzed by the sudden shift in the strategic situation. Helen asked if the Vrel consortium had made any moves yet. The Vrel were the real power behind the Crethon Empire, an ancient race that preferred to manipulate others rather than fight their own battles. Greg checked his screens and reported that Vrel ships were beginning to withdraw from forward positions, leaving the Crethon to face humanity alone. Helen nodded grimly at this news. Coalition warfare only worked when all partners believed in certain victory. Once doubt entered the equation, alliances could collapse faster than they had formed. Back on the Valiant, Daniel received a priority transmission from Earth. President Carol Hughes appeared on his screen, her face showing the strain of the last few weeks. She had been the one to authorize this mission, to approve this risky strategy, and Daniel knew she had taken enormous political heat for it. Hawks had called her too cautious, Doves had called her too aggressive, and everyone had an opinion about what humanity should do when faced with an extinction-level threat. Carol got straight to business and told Daniel that the Galactic Assembly had called an emergency session. They wanted to negotiate, wanted to find a peaceful solution, wanted to avoid the war that suddenly seemed to be rushing toward them. Daniel listened and then said with respect that they were past negotiation now. The time for talking had been before the Crethon sent their ultimatum, before they had backed humanity into a corner. Now was the time for demonstration, for showing the galaxy what it meant to threaten Earth. Carol looked like she wanted to argue but finally nodded. She trusted Daniel's judgment in military matters, and she understood that backing down now would make humanity look weak and indecisive. She told him to maintain position and await further orders, then ended the transmission. Ensign Kevin Brooks was monitoring the sensor array when he noticed something interesting happening at the edge of the system. Kevin was fresh from the academy, still eager and enthusiastic about military service, and he called out his findings with excitement in his voice. The Vrel Consortium ships were not just withdrawing, they were actually leaving the system entirely. Daniel turned to Lisa and asked for confirmation. Lisa worked her controls and verified that yes, the Vrel were abandoning their Crethon allies completely. Daniel allowed himself a small smile at this development. Fear was indeed contagious, especially in alliances built on perceived strength rather than genuine loyalty. Once one partner showed weakness, others rushed to distance themselves before they got dragged down too. On the Crethon homeworld, Supreme Commander Velix watched the human warship hanging in his sky and felt something he had not experienced in his long military career. True fear, not of dying in battle, but of what would come after any battle with these humans. Velix had built his reputation on careful analysis of enemy capabilities, on understanding not just what an opponent could do, but what they were willing to do. He had studied the transmission the humans had sent, had watched it 3 times, and had come to an uncomfortable conclusion. The humans were showing him their history, not as a threat but as a promise. They were saying that if the Crethons started a war, humanity would fight it with the same terrible determination they had shown in their own conflicts. Velix's military advisors were shouting at him, demanding he order an immediate attack on the human ship before it could do any damage. They pointed out that they had thousands of ships against one, that numerical superiority would guarantee victory, that the humans were bluffing. Velix listened to them and then asked a simple question. If they destroyed the Valiant, what would humanity do next? The advisors fell silent because they knew the answer. Earth would send more ships, would fight harder, would turn this into a war that might last for years or decades. The advisors argued that the Crethon Empire had conquered 47 star systems and had never lost a war. Velix agreed, but pointed out that they had never fought a species like humanity before. Every race they had conquered had been peaceful, had valued life and comfort over conflict, had chosen surrender when faced with overwhelming force. The humans valued something different. They valued freedom, and they had shown throughout their history that they would pay any price to keep it. Daniel stood on the bridge of the Valiant and felt the weight of 3,000 lives resting on his shoulders. Every person on this ship had volunteered, had understood the risks, but that did not make him feel any less responsible for their safety. He walked over to Jake's station and asked how the weapon systems were holding up. Jake reported that everything was functioning perfectly, that they could fire at any time if needed, but that he hoped it would not come to that. Daniel clapped him on the shoulder and said that hope was a good thing to have, even in war. He moved to Susan's station and asked if there had been any attempts at communication from the Crethon. Susan said that the planetary government had tried to hail them twice, but had not transmitted anything when given the chance. It seemed like they were trying to figure out what to say, how to respond to a situation they had never encountered before. Lisa called Daniel back to the center of the bridge and showed him an analysis she had been working on. The Crethon fleet formations were all defensive now, concentrated around key orbital installations rather than positioned to attack. Their weapons were cold, their shields were at minimum power, and their movement suggested they were waiting for the Valiant to make the first move. Daniel studied the display and understood what he was seeing. The Crethon were terrified of provoking humanity into actual combat. They had based their entire strategy on intimidation, and now that someone had intimidated them back, they did not know how to respond. Greg Palmer was tracking developments across the entire region from his post on Earth. He sent regular updates to Admiral Price, noting that the crisis was having effects far beyond just the Crethon homeworld. 8 species that had been under Crethon protection were declaring independence, sensing that the Empire was weakened and might not be able to enforce its will anymore. 15 Crethon border fleets had pulled back from human colonies without being asked, apparently deciding that provoking Earth further was a bad idea. Trade routes that had been closed to human ships were suddenly open again, as local governors made their own decisions without waiting for central authority. Helen watched these developments with satisfaction. The Crethon had maintained their empire through fear and the perception of invincibility. Daniel had shattered that perception with a single bold move, and now the entire structure was crumbling. She knew that the coming days would be critical, that humanity needed to press its advantage without overplaying its hand. They needed the galaxy to see them as strong and determined, not as aggressive conquerors. The difference was subtle but important. Daniel had not attacked anyone, had not destroyed anything, had simply shown up and said that humanity would not be pushed around anymore. That was a message the galaxy could understand and even respect, as long as Earth did not turn into the very thing they were fighting against. Helen sent new orders to Daniel, telling him to maintain position but to avoid any aggressive actions. The Valiant was to be a symbol, a reminder, a promise of what would happen if anyone tried to subjugate humanity again. Daniel acknowledged the orders and settled in for what he knew would be a long wait. Wars were not won in moments, but in the long grinding pressure of will against will, and humanity had just demonstrated that their will was stronger than anyone had imagined. Ambassador Richard Cole stood before the Galactic Assembly and felt the weight of hundreds of alien eyes upon him. The chamber was massive, carved from a single piece of crystal on the neutral world of Sanctuary, and it held representatives from over 200 species. Richard had been a diplomat for 15 years but had never spoken before the full assembly until now. Earth had always been represented by minor officials at lower-level meetings, dismissed as unimportant by the major powers. Today was different. Today the galaxy was paying attention because humanity had done something that shocked them all. The Vrel observer spoke first, its voice translated into a language Richard could understand. The observer was tall, covered in chitinous plates with compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. It demanded that the human vessel withdraw from Crethon space immediately, claiming that the Valiant violated every protocol and law the Assembly had established. If humanity did not comply, the observer said, the Assembly would have no choice but to authorize collective military action against Earth. Richard listened to this threat and felt no fear, only a cold anger that he kept carefully hidden behind a diplomatic smile. He waited until the observer finished speaking, and then said that he wanted to be very clear about something. The ESS Valiant was not just a warship. It was a message, and judging by the Crethon fleet's reaction, that message had been received loud and clear. Lieutenant Amy Foster stood near the chamber entrance, her hand resting casually near her sidearm. Amy was Richard's military attaché, a veteran of 3 tours on the frontier colonies where she had seen firsthand what happened when the Crethon decided to take what they wanted. She had lost friends to Crethon raids, had watched colonies burn, had helped evacuate civilians while Crethon ships destroyed everything of value. She knew exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed too far, and she was glad that the galaxy was finally learning that lesson. The Crethon delegate spoke next, a smaller being than the Vrel but no less imposing in its anger. It hissed through its translator that humanity had threatened the Crethon homeworld, that this was an act of war, that Earth would pay dearly for its aggression. Richard held up a hand and said no, that was not accurate. An act of war would have been destroying cities from orbit, killing millions, leaving the planet in ruins. The Valiant had not fired a single weapon, had not harmed a single being, had simply shown the Crethon who humanity was. The question now, Richard said calmly, was whether the Crethon wanted to find out what humans were truly capable of when they actually went to war. The chamber fell silent at these words. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others whispered among themselves. Richard could see calculations happening behind alien eyes as species that had dismissed humanity as primitive suddenly reassessed that judgment. Back aboard the Valiant, Science Officer Patricia Lang was analyzing data from across the region. Patricia had degrees in xenopolitics and strategic studies, and she understood that what was happening here went far beyond a simple military standoff. She reported to Daniel that 15 Crethon border fleets had pulled back from human colonies in the last few hours. 8 separate species that had been under Crethon protection had declared independence since the Valiant arrived. The Crethon trade networks were experiencing massive disruptions as partners suddenly decided they did not need Crethon approval for their business dealings anymore. Daniel listened to these reports and nodded thoughtfully. The Empire was fracturing from within, and all he had done was show them that humanity was not afraid to fight. The Crethon had maintained control through fear and intimidation, but now someone had introduced them to a fear they could not conquer. Commander Alan Price joined the discussion from engineering. Alan had been keeping the Valiant running at peak efficiency throughout the mission, and now he asked Daniel a practical question. If this escalated to actual combat, how long could they hold position against the enemy fleet? Daniel looked at his chief engineer and said as long as it took, but he did not think combat would happen. He pointed to the tactical display showing the Crethon fleet formations. They were defensive, reactive, waiting for humanity to make the first move. They were terrified of what the human response might be if they attacked first. On Earth, General Frank Newton was coordinating fleet movements from the Global Defense Headquarters. Frank had been a soldier for 40 years and had seen humanity go from a single planet species to one that controlled dozens of colonies. He had watched the Crethon push Earth around, had obeyed orders to retreat when outgunned, had swallowed his pride and done what was necessary to keep humanity alive. Now finally humanity was pushing back, and Frank felt a fierce satisfaction at the change. He had 63 warships positioned at strategic points throughout the region, not attacking, not threatening, simply existing. Present and watching and ready, the message was clear to anyone paying attention. Humanity was done being the victim, done accepting whatever scraps the major powers decided to give them. The Crethon delegate at the assembly was still arguing, still demanding that Earth be punished for its aggression. Richard listened patiently and then pointed out a simple fact. The Crethon Empire had sent an ultimatum to Earth demanding total surrender. What exactly did the delegate expect humanity to do? Simply accept annexation and slavery? The delegate started to respond, but Richard cut him off. Earth had tried negotiation, had offered compromises, had bent over backward to find peaceful solutions. The Crethon had rejected everything and demanded unconditional surrender. So humanity had responded in the only way that apparently got through to aggressive empires. They had shown strength. Several smaller species in the assembly began speaking up, emboldened by Richard's words. A delegate from a species Richard did not recognize said that her people had suffered under Crethon domination for decades. Another said that the assembly's rules only seemed to protect the strong, while the weak were left to fend for themselves. A third openly praised humanity for having the courage to stand up to the empire. Richard watched this carefully and realized that the political landscape was shifting faster than anyone had expected. The Crethon and Vrel had maintained power partly through the silence of their victims, species too afraid to speak out against them. Now that silence was breaking, and voices long suppressed were finding the courage to be heard, the Vrel observer tried to regain control of the discussion, demanding order and threatening consequences for species that challenged the established structure. But the genie was out of the bottle now, and threats that had worked for centuries suddenly seemed hollow. Amy caught Richard's eye and gave him a slight nod. She could see what he saw. This was not just about the Crethon anymore. This was about the entire galactic power structure, and humanity had inadvertently started something much larger than a simple territorial dispute. Daniel received an update from Earth about the assembly meeting. President Hughes told him that Richard was doing an excellent job representing humanity, that public opinion in the assembly was turning in Earth's favor, but that the situation remained dangerous. The Vrel were not going to give up their position easily, and they still had enormous military resources they could bring to bear. Carol asked Daniel if he thought the Crethon would actually attack. Daniel considered the question carefully and said that he did not think so, at least not without Vrel's support, and the Vrel seemed more interested in cutting their losses than in doubling down on a bad bet. Carol asked what would happen if he was wrong. Daniel said honestly that if the Crethon attacked, the Valiant would fight and probably be destroyed, but that destruction would prove to the galaxy that humanity meant what it said. Sometimes, he told the president, the most important battles were the ones you lost because they showed your enemies that victory would cost more than they wanted to pay. Carol was quiet for a moment and then told Daniel to trust his judgment and keep her informed. The transmission ended and Daniel returned his attention to the tactical situation. 3 days had passed since the Valiant arrived, and the stalemate continued. The Crethon fleet maintained its defensive posture. The Valiant held position in orbit. Neither side moved, neither side blinked, and in that frozen moment Daniel knew that humanity was winning. Not through violence, not through conquest, but through simple, stubborn refusal to back down. He thought about all the species in the galaxy who had accepted subjugation, because fighting seemed too costly. He thought about Earth's history, about all the times humans had fought impossible odds because the alternative was worse than death. He thought about the crew around him, young men and women who had volunteered to face down an empire because someone needed to draw a line and say this far, and no further. The bridge crew worked quietly, efficiently, maintaining their posts hour after hour. They did not complain, did not question, did not waver. They were doing their duty, and in that simple act they were changing the course of galactic history. Daniel felt proud to serve with them, proud to be human, proud to be part of a species that refused to bow to anyone. 3 days into the standoff, Captain Nina Wells of the ESS Defiant sent a priority message that changed everything. Nina commanded one of the other human warships positioned near the Crethon mining colonies in the Outer Verge, and she had been monitoring local military communications since arriving on station. Her message was brief but significant. The Crethon Third Fleet had mutinied. Over 200 ships and their crews were refusing orders to mobilize against human positions. Nina said the mutiny appeared to be spreading to other units as well, with reports of junior officers questioning commands and enlisted personnel, demanding to know why they were being ordered to fight a war nobody wanted. Daniel received this news on the bridge of the Valiant and felt a deep satisfaction. The Crethon military was fracturing because every soldier, no matter what species, understood basic mathematics. Fighting humanity would mean casualties, lots of them, and none of those soldiers wanted to be the ones to die in a war their leaders had started through arrogance and greed. Lisa looked up from her tactical display and said quietly that this was what happened when you built an empire on fear. The moment someone scared you back, your own people started asking why they should die for your ambitions. Lieutenant Commander Scott Russell was monitoring the tactical situation when he detected new contacts entering the system. Scott was the Valiant's tactical officer, a veteran of the border wars who had lost his brother to a Crethon raid 5 years ago. He called out the contacts with professional calm, reporting that the Vrel Consortium was deploying their Hammer fleet. 300 ships, all heavy combat vessels, heading directly for the Valiant's position. This was the response Daniel had been expecting but hoping to avoid. The Vrel were not going to let their carefully constructed galactic order collapse without a fight. They were going to force the situation, make humanity back down or be destroyed, and hope that a show of overwhelming force would restore the status quo. Daniel stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars. He had known this moment might come, had planned for it, had accepted it. The Vrel had made a critical error in judgment. They assumed humanity would retreat when faced with impossible odds. They did not understand that humans had been facing impossible odds since they first climbed down from the trees and decided to hunt animals 10 times their size. He turned back to his crew and ordered battle stations. The call went out through the ship, and 3,000 people moved to their assigned positions with practiced efficiency. Jake Morrison's hands moved across his weapons console, bringing primary systems online. Scott refined targeting solutions and fed data to the gunnery crews. Lisa coordinated with engineering and damage control, making sure every system was operating at peak performance. Daniel sat in his command chair and opened a channel to the Vrel fleet. He transmitted a simple message. Come closer. Please. On Earth, President Hughes was in an emergency meeting with her cabinet when word of the Vrel deployment reached them. Secretary of Defense Paul Grant immediately advocated for full fleet mobilization, arguing that Earth needed to show support for the Valiant with overwhelming force of its own. Others argued for attempting diplomatic intervention, for trying to negotiate before shots were fired. Carol listened to all of them, and then raised her hand for silence. She said that they needed to trust Daniel Harris and his crew. The Valiant had been sent to make a point, and now the Vrel were testing whether humanity meant what it said. If Earth backed down now, if they ordered the Valiant to retreat, every species in the galaxy would know that human resolve could be broken with sufficient pressure. Carol's decision was final. The Valiant would hold position, and if the Vrel wanted a fight, they would get one. In the depths of the Valiant, Chief Petty Officer Laura Martin and her damage control teams prepared for what might come. Laura had been through the border wars, had seen ships torn apart by enemy fire, had pulled wounded crew members from burning compartments. She gathered her teams and told them something she had learned in combat. They did not have to win this fight. They just had to make the Vrel understand that even victory would cost more than they wanted to pay. Her teams nodded grimly and checked their equipment. They were ready to do their jobs, ready to keep the ship fighting for as long as possible, ready to die if that was what duty required. The Vrel fleet entered weapons range, and their commander opened a channel to the Valiant. The being that appeared on Daniel's screen called itself the Eternal Voice, and it spoke with the absolute confidence of someone who had never lost. It told Daniel that humanity had shown courage, but courage was not enough against inevitability. The Valiant could withdraw now and live, or it could stay and be destroyed. The choice was simple. Daniel stood and looked directly into the camera. He said that the Eternal Voice was right about one thing. The choice was simple. Humanity could bow to stronger powers and accept whatever scraps they were given, or they could stand and fight and show the galaxy that Earth would not be conquered without a cost that no one wanted to pay. Daniel told Jake to target the Vrel flagship, not to destroy it, just to show them that the Valiant could. Jake's fingers moved with practiced precision. The Valiant's primary lance weapon, a device capable of piercing planetary shields and destroying cities, powered up. Energy readings spiked across every sensor in the system. But Daniel did not give the order to fire. Instead, Jake painted the Vrel flagship with targeting data, a bright electronic marker that told the enemy exactly where the shot would hit. The Vrel would see it on their sensors. They would know that in the microseconds it would take them to fire their first volley, humanity could decapitate their entire command structure. The Eternal Voice hesitated. It was a tiny pause, barely a heartbeat, but everyone watching saw it. That moment of uncertainty told the entire galaxy everything they needed to know. Lisa spoke softly from her station. She said that the Vrel were not used to fighting an enemy that was both smart and dangerous. Most species they conquered either had technology but no will to fight, or they had fighting spirit but primitive weapons. Humanity had both, and that combination was something the Vrel had never encountered before. Daniel nodded and said that humans fought smart and hard, and that was what made them dangerous to empires built on intimidation. The tactical display showed the Vrel fleet holding position, no longer advancing, weapons charging but not firing. Daniel could see the calculation happening in the Eternal Voice's mind. If they attacked, they would probably destroy the Valiant eventually through sheer numbers, but that first shot from the human ship would kill the Eternal Voice and its entire staff. The second shot would take out another flagship. The third would destroy their primary carrier. Yes, they would win, but the leadership of their hammer fleet would be dead, and for what? To prove a point? To maintain an image of invincibility that was already crumbling? Scott reported that the Vrel fleet was receiving new orders from their homeworld. Long-range communications suggested a heated debate among the consortium leadership about how to proceed. Some wanted to attack immediately, to crush humanity and restore fear. Others advocated for caution, for finding a way to de-escalate without appearing weak. The fact that they were debating at all meant Daniel had already won this encounter. An empire that was truly confident did not hesitate. Daniel opened a new channel, this time broadcasting to the entire Vrel fleet, not just its commander. He said that he wanted every Vrel officer and crew member to understand something. If they attacked the Valiant, some of them would die. Maybe a lot of them. The Valiant would go down fighting, and it would take as many Vrel ships with it as possible. But even after the Valiant was destroyed, even after every human on this ship was dead, Earth would send more ships. Humanity would keep fighting, keep resisting, keep making the Vrel pay for every system they tried to hold. He asked them to imagine that war, a conflict that might last for years or decades, a war where victory meant nothing if the enemy refused to acknowledge defeat. He asked them to think about their families, their lives, their futures, and decide if maintaining the consortium's pride was worth dying for. The Eternal Voice cut the transmission angrily, but the message had been sent and received. Daniel knew that every crew member on every Vrel ship had heard his words, and now they were looking at their commanders and wondering the same thing. Why were they being asked to die in a war that served no purpose except to maintain an empire's reputation? Nina Wells sent another update from her position near the mining colonies. The mutiny in the Crethon Third Fleet had spread to 2 more fleets, and now Crethon commanders were requesting to speak with human representatives. They wanted to negotiate, wanted to find a way out of this crisis that did not involve mass casualties. The empire that had seemed so strong just a week ago was collapsing from within, and all because humanity had done something no one expected. They had shown strength without using it, had demonstrated capability without deploying it, had made their enemies afraid without firing a single shot. Daniel looked around his bridge at the men and women who had followed him into this impossible situation. They had held their positions for days under constant threat. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Supreme Commander Velix opened a direct channel to the Valiant, bypassing all official protocols and military hierarchies. When his image appeared on Daniel's screen, the alien commander looked exhausted in a way that transcended species barriers. Velix spoke through his translator and said that he wanted to propose a meeting, face-to-face on neutral ground. No weapons, no guards, just two military officers trying to find a way out of a crisis that benefited no one. Daniel considered the offer carefully while his crew watched. Ambassador Richard Cole was patched in from the assembly, and he gave his assessment. It could be a trap, certainly, but Richard did not think so. Velix had a reputation for pragmatism, and had always chosen the option that preserved his forces rather than the one that satisfied his pride. He was watching his empire collapse and looking for a way to stop the bleeding, without appearing to surrender. Daniel made his decision and accepted the meeting. 24 hours later, he stood in a small observation room on Sanctuary Station, the neutral ground where the Galactic Assembly met. Across from him sat Velix, and between them was only a simple table. No weapons, no recording devices, just two beings trying to understand each other. Velix spoke first, and his words were blunt. He said that humanity was insane, that no rational species would risk total annihilation the way humans had. Daniel shook his head and corrected the alien commander. Humans were not insane, they were experienced. There was a difference, and it was an important one. Velix touched a control, and holographic images appeared in the space between them. He said that he had studied the transmission Daniel had sent, had watched Earth's history of warfare over and over. He had seen the world wars, the civil conflicts, the species fighting itself to the edge of extinction multiple times. He wanted to understand how a species could survive that kind of self-destruction. Daniel looked at the images and said that survival was the key word. Humanity had come close to destroying itself, yes, but they had always pulled back from the edge. They had learned slowly and painfully how to fight without ending everything, but more importantly, they had learned that they could endure things that would break other species. They could fight for years, for decades, for generations if necessary. They did not need to win quickly. They just needed to keep fighting until the fighting was done, no matter how long that took. Velix was silent for a long moment, and Daniel could see the alien mind working through implications and calculations. Finally, Velix said that the Vrel Consortium wanted him to continue the confrontation. They believed that numerical superiority would eventually prevail, that humanity could be ground down through attrition. Daniel asked what Velix himself believed. The Crethon commander leaned back in his seat and spoke with complete honesty. He said that even if they destroyed the Valiant, even if they killed every human in the fleet, even if they burned the colonies and blockaded Earth itself, he believed that humanity would rebuild. They would come back, and when they did, they would be harder, meaner, more determined than before. That was what his study of human history had taught him. You could defeat humanity in a battle, maybe even in a war, but you could never make them accept that defeat as permanent. They would always come back for another round, and each time they would have learned from their losses and adapted. Velix said that his empire had conquered 47 star systems over 3,000 years. They had defeated species with better technology, with larger populations, with more resources, but they had never fought a species that simply refused to stay beaten. Daniel nodded slowly and said that Velix was a wise being for understanding that truth. He stood and walked to the observation window, looking out at the stars beyond. He said that humanity did not want to conquer the galaxy or build an empire. They just wanted to be left alone to grow, to explore, to exist without someone always trying to subjugate them. The Galactic Assembly had rules that were supposed to protect younger species, but those rules only seemed to apply to the weak, while the strong did whatever they wanted. That had to end, and humanity was drawing the line. Velix asked the practical question that military commanders always asked. What happened now? Daniel had made his point, had scared the galaxy, had shown that humanity would not go quietly. Was that enough, or did Earth want something more? Daniel turned from the window and said that fear was not what humanity wanted. Respect was the goal. They wanted other species to understand that humans were not prey, not servants, not resources to be exploited. They were equals who deserved the same rights and protections as any other sentient beings. The assembly needed to actually enforce its own rules instead of looking the other way when powerful empires preyed on weaker ones. Velik said that such changes would require a complete restructuring of galactic politics, and many species would resist. Daniel smiled and said that was true, but the alternative was worse. If the assembly did not reform itself, if it continued to allow the strong to dominate the weak, then eventually every species would reach the point where they had nothing left to lose. And beings with nothing to lose were the most dangerous enemies of all, because they would fight with a desperation that no amount of firepower could overcome. Over the next 3 days, negotiations proceeded faster than anyone had expected. Felix had the authority to speak for the Crethon Empire, and he used that authority to make real concessions. All territorial claims on human colonies were withdrawn. Reparations would be paid for destroyed ships and stolen resources. Crethon forces would pull back to their core systems and cease expansion operations. But the negotiations went beyond just the Crethon. Richard Cole worked with delegates from dozens of species to draft a new charter for the Galactic Assembly. The new rules would include enforcement mechanisms that actually had teeth, protections for younger species that could not be ignored, and consequences for empires that violated the rights of others. The Vrel tried to block the reforms, but they found themselves isolated. Too many species had been victimized by the old system, and humanity's example had given them courage to speak up. The Vrel Consortium, seeing which way the political winds were blowing, quietly backed down rather than face a coalition of angry species who suddenly were not afraid anymore. The Valiant remained in orbit above the Crethon homeworld for another week, a silent reminder of what had changed. Then, as quietly as it had arrived, the great warship prepared to depart. Daniel stood on the bridge and felt a mixture of relief and pride as the crew executed departure procedures. Lisa brought him a final report showing 0 human casualties throughout the entire crisis. The estimated economic impact on the Crethon Empire was catastrophic, and the political impact on the galactic balance of power amounted to a complete restructuring. Jake added with evident satisfaction that they had accomplished all of this without firing a single weapon. Daniel allowed himself a rare smile and said that sometimes the most powerful weapon was the one you never had to use, as long as everyone knew you were willing to use it. The jump coordinates locked in, and the Valiant began its journey home. Behind them, the Crethon system and the galaxy beyond had changed in fundamental ways, not because humanity had conquered anyone, but because they had proven something far more important. They had shown that they were survivors, that they would endure any hardship and pay any price to remain free. In a universe that respected strength above all else, survival was the ultimate form of power. The crew moved through the ship with new confidence, knowing that they had been part of something historic. They had faced down an empire, had stared into the face of overwhelming force, and had not blinked. They had represented not just Earth, but the idea that no species should bow to another simply because of military might. As Earth grew larger in the view screens, Daniel recorded a final log entry for the mission. He said that when the Valiant entered orbit above the Crethon homeworld, silence had followed. Not the silence of death, but the silence of understanding. The Crethon and their allies had finally understood who humanity was and what they represented. More importantly, they had understood that they never wanted to find out what humans were truly capable of when pushed to their limits. The mission was accomplished, and they were heading home. Carol Hughes was waiting when the Valiant docked at Earth's primary orbital station. She came aboard personally to greet the crew, something presidents rarely did, but she wanted them to know how much their sacrifice had meant. She told Daniel that he and his crew had not just saved Earth from subjugation. They had changed the course of galactic history and given hope to countless species who had been living under the threat of domination. Daniel accepted the praise on behalf of his crew, but reminded the president that the real work was just beginning. Humanity had made enemies with this action, powerful ones who would not forget or forgive. Earth needed to stay strong, stay vigilant, and be ready to back up its newfound reputation with continued resolve. The age of humanity being pushed around was over, Carol agreed, but that meant accepting new responsibilities. Earth would need to help protect other species who could not protect themselves,